would you like to start and share with us?
As a journalist who reports extensively on disabilities, I've always found the coverage of disabilities in India wanting in terms of its adequacy and accuracy. Even during the pandemic, when Indian media's lens did turn to a few marginalized communities, disability coverage was sparse. And it made me wonder why staff journalists with disabilities in newsrooms were not taking the lead. In order to get an answer to my question, I started looking for those journalists, but couldn't find many. There is a huge dearth of representation of disability in Indian newsrooms, which is possibly also the reason for lack of inclusion and accessibility in the news media. This thought turned into a proposal for the Reuters Institute for the Study of Journalism, who granted me a fellowship to conduct this research for 6 months at the University of Oxford last year. The result of the study was my paper, a 9-step plan for curb-cutting disability access in India's news and newsrooms, which is linked to my profile in case you're interested in checking it out. Today, I'll be talking about what I discovered about the underrepresentation of disability and the lack of accessibility in the news media and how it can be fixed. But before that, I'll request Jelsyna to introduce herself.
Sure. Thank you so much, Preeti, and thank you also for reiterating your introduction, because it makes me, it reinforces the idea that there are so many similarities between us, and yet we are so different in terms of our work and even like our identities as a professional. So I am a legal journalist with Bar and Bench, as Anant has already mentioned, and I report extensively on law school news, disability rights matters, and also I conduct interviews of legal professionals across countries, but who are mostly Indian bred lawyers. So that's what I predominantly do, very briefly. So I had conducted this law school survey as part of my work as a journalist later last year. And as part of the survey, I had interviewed very extensively 40 law students with disabilities, both visible and invisible disabilities, across 18 national law schools and traditional law schools. So my findings from this survey was very, very unique and something that I didn't really expect. And this being the first of its kind work that was undertaken ever in legal journalism and even at Bar and Bench, it was something that really excited me, and especially because this was an initiative that I proposed. It was something that really sparked interest, and it made my face glow, to be very honest. So, so during the course of this fireside chat, I really would look forward to sharing all my findings that I could gather as part of this survey, and also like broad recommendations probably, so that we can make law schools and even educational institutions, primary education, secondary education, tertiary and higher education, more inclusive of persons with disabilities, because generally, like Preeti has also mentioned, persons with disabilities and their issues very rarely get the limelight. And because there is nobody talking about this, there is no reinforcement of the issues that persons with disabilities face. It's very difficult to even recognize that what are the needs that persons with disabilities require, and that therefore what are the reasonable accommodations that they require. If we don't know the needs that they if we don't know what they need, it is very difficult for anyone, including themselves, to ask for reasonable accommodations. And reasonable accommodations are the primary pillar of the United Nations Convention on Rights of Persons with Disabilities. And unless you vocalize and articulate what you need, nobody, including authorities, can help you. So, yeah, broadly, that's what I would like to touch upon today. Preeti, would you like to go ahead and share what do you think are the barriers faced by persons with disabilities in newsrooms specifically, and also the consumers who are persons with disabilities, or consumers of news who are persons with disabilities?
Yeah. I think I'll first start with why the improvement of
Right.
representation of people with
Of
disabilities
course.
in the news media is even
Correct.
required. So let's first consider this. So it's very simple, actually. Isn't the news media supposed to reflect the society it serves? It is, right? It's essential for engagement and it's essential for trust in the media. So, for example, say how would a queer person relate to news that doesn't have a queer perspective? Or how would, say, a deaf person media which is not accessible to them, meaning if it doesn't have sign language interpretation or captions? News has to be made for audiences, and people with disabilities form the largest minority in the world. So they are actually a very important audience for news media, which I found the news media doesn't recognize. The WHO estimates that 16% of the world's population has a disability. Apart from that, a growing proportion of the world's population is elderly, and elderly people have varying disabilities. People are sometimes temporarily disabled when they meet with an accident or develop an illness. Altogether, that makes it way more than 16% of the global population. Let me show you another perspective. Did you know that a voice recognition software was developed in the 1990s for people who couldn't physically write? Or that audiobooks were first recorded on vinyl records for blind people in 1932? Or that the keyboard was first invented in 1608 as a typewriter for blind people? Or that text messaging was developed in 1992 for deaf people? In fact, even a specific brand of potato peeler was invented for people with arthritis. So you see, these are all things that we use in our everyday life, even people who are non disabled. So, innovations, programs, laws, or policies designed to benefit vulnerable groups, such as people with disabilities, often end up benefiting the entire society. And there's a term for it. It's called curb cut effect. When we do something for people with disabilities, we do it for everyone. And if that is still not enough, there is a legal mandate for the media, or for that matter, every digital entity to be digitally accessible. And the deadline for that in India was 4 years ago in June 2019. I'll leave you with that thought, and I'll ask Jelsyna to tell you why she decided to undertake the law school survey and interview law students with disabilities.
Thank you so much, Preeti, and for those very insightful comments and thoughts. Um, Answering your question, um, so I graduated from law school in 2020, in the midst of the pandemic, the COVID batch, as everyone calls it. So 5 years of law school was extremely challenging for me as a person with chronic illness. To be more specific, I've had the first 25 years of my life suffering from autoimmune disorders, and I had rashes all over my face and limbs, which made it very difficult not just to combat the social stigma that was attached to my appearance, but also to go about my everyday life without having to think about how am I going to do a certain thing, which is very easy for someone who is an able-bodied person. For example, the simplest of things like attending a 7 o'clock lecture used to be extremely challenging for me, and this peaked especially because for every skin condition, if you know, there is a, an aggravated sense of an eruption, or these rashes tend to aggravate during the nights and midnights, which means that I wouldn't really get sleep at night. And if I had to attend a 7 o'clock lecture, I had to wake up at 4:30 or 5 o'clock just so that I can stay under the shower for at least an hour, so that and post an hour long shower I needed to moisturize myself and put a lot of creams so that I will be presentable enough to spend the rest of the day at college or in a public surrounding. Now, for someone who has to live this as a life reality, it is extremely difficult. It's not just in terms of combating the social stigma, it's also in terms of, the pain that is associated with living with a skin condition that is problematic or troublesome. It's also about living with uh, the irritation that comes with the constant itching sensation that is there constantly. And imagine when there is something that is so intrinsically a part of you, uh, and you have to live with it for the rest, like for the entire day. There is a lot of irritation that is associated with your existence. The very existence of skin on your face or body is painful and irritable. Now, having to not just pay attention in class or participate in class, just going about your everyday law school activities along with something like this was extremely challenging. Now, how did I go about, my everyday life in law school and outside of law school as well? I made sure to put myself in extracurricular activities, uh, to an extent that I didn't like I shifted the focus from the irritation that was within me to something that was larger than me. And when I was doing this, obviously there were a lot of people that I had to encounter, and a lot of um, mindsets that I not just mindsets, but a lot of repulsiveness in the way people looked at me even. And that affects a lot for a person, especially when I am so sensitive by nature. When you recognize that, there's someone who is shifting their face away just because they see you, or if they're making weird faces just because they're looking at you, your troubled appearance, it troubles me a lot. It troubles anyone because it's very psychological. And most skin conditions and most autoimmune skin conditions, they are very psychosomatic. So the moment there is a trigger of stress, there is a lot of, the skin condition, even if you put a lot of moisturizers, there is a lot of reaction and a lot of uneasiness that is associated with your appearance and your existence. Now, um, that being that being one part of my reality, the second part of my reality is also that I made sure to uh, try to approach authorities and try to get reasonable accommodations in terms of not just me as a person with disability, invisible disabilities, but like physically visible disabilities. But it was not back then, for the longest time, recognized as a disability even. Chronic illness is not really seen as a disability unless you articulate and put forth that you need certain accommodations. But most times you won't believe, even though I went to a law school which taught about and researched and advocated for disability rights. There was an entire center for equal opportunity and disability rights, but still it was extremely difficult for me to get the accommodations that I would ask for. And these accommodations were very basic in terms of, like, now if I reached class like 5 or 10 minutes late, I should not be I should not be punished to the extent that I wouldn't get I wouldn't get attendance, when attendance is a very crucial criterion. And probably accommodations, like, not giving me the amount of workload that probably an able-bodied counterpart could take up. Now, these are very minute and very reasonable accommodations that anyone would expect, and these are not things that you even have to vocalize. If somebody is empathetic enough to look at you and see that you are in physical discomfort, they on their own are supposed to be giving you these accommodations, and they should not expect you to function the same way as an able-bodied counterpart. Now, the challenges that I faced were too many. It went to the extent of having to take a semester a semester gap, because there was a point in time in college where, apart from my skin condition on my face, there was ties around both my eyes, to the extent that I had to stay under the shower for 2 hours just so that my eyes would open up. Like, the eyelids would shut, and it would get stuck, and it was very painful. And uh, even if I navigated through all of that, I would put those dark black goggles and go to class. And even if I went to class like that, it was extremely fatiguing. It was extremely challenging to go through the entire day. And even then, if I missed 5 to 10 minutes of class, like if I reached late, I would have to answer the teacher as to why I came late, even though it is very visible that hey, I have a health condition which is not permitting to come on time. And that is one side of the story. And it's also a lot to do about, uh, the very fact that I had a semester gap played a lot on my psychology, because I was among the group of people who would be among, the cream crowd in college, who would be doing excellent in academics and extracurriculars. For someone like that, with that background, having to take a semester gap is not easy. When you have to join college again with a batch that is lower than you, junior than you, it's very difficult. And I still have a lot of PTSD from, that semester gap that I have had to inevitably take because of my health condition. And I realized that if this is happening to me in a college which is so pro disability rights, what happens to somebody in another college which is not so aware about disability rights? Or what happens to colleges or schools which don't even know about something like disability rights, who are not even aware of the concept of invisible disabilities? Imagine this is happening in a law institution, a legal institution. I have absolutely no idea about how dire and grim the situation is in another, educational institution. Now, with that intent in mind, I realize that it is extremely important to blow the whistle on, you know, um, the ground realities of law students. At least law students is something that I could tap into because I'm working in a legal news media publication. So I thought, and since I have a lawyer background as well, and since I've gone to law school and I have lived experiences of navigating through administrative rigidity, I realized that, there are so many other whose stories don't even probably come out in the limelight. I have the skills to speak, so I can share my story. But what about others who don't have the skills to speak up, or who don't have the platforms to share their experiences? What happens to them? It does not mean that their stories are invalid or their experiences are invalid. So, just with this intent in mind, I thought I should give this a shot, and I thought of, taking this forward. So that was the starting point, the thought process behind taking an extensive survey and writing a series of articles on this topic. Hope that answered your question, Preeti.
Yeah, thank you so much, Jelsyna. I'm so, you know, intrigued by what you said.
Yeah,
It's so difficult to understand the complexity of the various barriers that a person faces,
correct,
because we hear of disabilities like blindness and deafness, and these are things that we can imagine the barriers. We can imagine what kind of barriers a person with blindness or a deaf person would face, but it's so difficult to imagine or even think about other disabilities like yours, like chronic illness, autoimmune diseases, itching. I mean, I've gone through it. I know how it feels, but it's nowhere close to your experience. It's just so different, and there is so much diversity in disability,
correct,
and
absolutely,
that is something that people cannot imagine. And I mean, I wish that the media was able to bring out these kind of experiences so that
correct,
others who are going through the same kind of experiences like you can learn from them, or others can even understand someone who goes through these experiences and how they you know kind of manage their life or manage their disease, and you know and then talk about what they are doing, and not just say they are inspirational. So on that note, I'll get to
yeah.
I
So would you like to continue and share with us what the barriers are,
yeah,
what the barriers faced by persons with disabilities who are probably journalists and consumers of news?
yeah, that's right. I'll move on to see let's move on to see the barriers disabled consumers of news space.
Okay.
um, and this happens because they are not considered audiences by the news media.
Oh,
So yeah, I mean, when I was conducting this study, I asked a few editors, I asked a few newsrooms, how many audiences with disabilities did they have? Did they ever conduct a survey or any, did they have any metrics on that?
Right.
They were quiet. They were just silent. They said, no, we don't know. We never did that. So yeah, so they're just not considered audiences. That is why they don't make media for them.
Right.
So, for example, so blind and some partially sighted people use screen readers to read text to them on their phone or computers. And screen readers are called assistive software. Now, a lot of websites, news websites, are cluttered with pop-ups, autoplay videos, and text disrupted by advertisements, which makes them unnavigable for screen reader users. When the
Okay.
screen
Right.
reader moves on the screen, it first reads the ads. It doesn't skip them. So imagine the
Oh.
pain. Imagine how painful it is to read the news on some
Hmm.
sites. You first go to Amazon, then you go to say whatever Flipkart, and then you keep going on, and then you reach the actual news that you want to read. Buttons are not clearly labeled, so the screen reader cannot find the right page or the right place to read stuff. Some major news sites have introduced audio components like text to speech for listening to articles, but
Okay.
the
Right.
rest needs to catch up.
Correct.
Then deaf people need sign language interpretation or captions,
Right.
but neither of them are used in television,
Hmm.
except on GT in the 3 morning slots, which is not enough. Why can't a
Right.
deaf
Of course.
person watch news at other times of the day? Why would
Absolutely.
why would we think that a deaf person wouldn't want to watch news at other times of the day? Then transcripts are the only way deaf and deafblind users can consume podcasts. But podcasts on news sites do not have transcripts.
Hmm.
Videos lack captions or subtitles, and auto-generated or AI-generated captions are inaccurate, creating confusion among deaf readers. Images almost never have alt text. Alt text is a description of the image for people who cannot see and use screen readers. The screen reader reads out the description of the image to them so that they understand what it is all about. Again, social media, which has become such an important way of accessing news, is not accessible either.
Hmm.
Now let's look at the coverage, the way stories of and about persons with disabilities are framed. I'll give you a few examples of what is not right. Some
Right.
of the inaccurate coverage, for example, highlights the stories of people with physical disabilities that are overly inspirational, portraying them as heroes.
Hmm.
And this they do even for doing their daily chores independently, despite their disability. So you must have seen this kind of language.
Yeah.
Some stories look at persons with disabilities as objects of pity.
Right.
And when it comes to people with psychosocial disabilities, don't even ask. Psychosocial
Hmm.
disabilities include depression, anxiety, schizophrenia, bipolar
Yeah.
disorder, etc. And their stories mostly focus on the darkest side of the disease without ever talking about successes.
Hmm.
I mean, people with psychosocial disabilities do live a good life. Why can't we talk about that?
Correct.
Reporting often reflects that people with psychosocial disabilities need to be rescued.
Hmm.
Then, in many publications, disability coverage is limited to International Disability Day. Okay, now 3rd of December, let's do some hero coverage.
Hmm.
Or if there is some very important news related to disability, then of course we hear about it. Otherwise, it's rare to find stories related to disability.
Hmm.
Since disability itself is underrepresented, complex issues such as the intersection of caste and sexual orientations with disability are almost absent from the media. Social prejudice, discrimination, and ableism are prevalent in the news based on the popular belief that typical abilities are superior. Perpetuation of negative stereotypes about disability never ends, it's just endless.
Hmm.
Yeah,
These are very pertinent, and these are like very like nuanced observations, but yet so glaring that you've pointed out. And it's extremely important to constantly reiterate these problems, because unless you talk about it, nobody is going to realize that these are problems that are worth taking cognizance of, and therefore worth acting upon
true,
in order for there to be change.
true, true.
Right.
So, Jelsyna, I will now ask you to talk about the highlights of the survey that you conducted.
Right. So, like I mentioned, the survey was the number of participants that were a part of the survey were 40, and they were all law students across 18 traditional and national law schools. Now, according to like broadly the kind of responses that I got, I categorized their responses in um, broad segments of four categories. That is one, like the four main categories of the challenges that were faced by students with disabilities predominantly were that of the physical and infrastructural barriers. That's the first one. The second one being academic barriers. Third one being the administrative rigidity that they faced. The fourth one being the social and attitudinal barriers. Now, this is across stakeholders in education institutions, and there was a dire need felt for sensitization across like stakeholders, like I mentioned, that is teachers, teaching and non-teaching faculty, administrative faculty, peer groups, and also other outsiders like visiting faculty, etc. Now, why is there, because the topic of disability rights, and because persons with disabilities form only a minuscule minority of the general population in law schools, and generally also, their needs or their issues are generally overlooked because they are seemed unimportant. And that persons with disabilities, because they don't talk, and they don't talk for themselves, or because it's very difficult to ask for reasonable accommodations because it is shifting from the status quo, there is a lot of hesitation with law students with disabilities also in vocalizing what they need. And in the rare instances that they have in fact vocalized what they require, um, there is a lot of hesitation, or there is a lot of resistance from the administration or the teaching and non-teaching faculty in meeting or even recognizing that the person who is asking for these accommodations, it has taken a lot for them to even vocalize what they are sharing with you. And you do not have any right to disregard their realities and demean or even disregard or consider their needs as unimportant. There have been very specific instances of discrimination, and direct and both direct and indirect discrimination that students with disabilities have faced when they have specifically asked for these reasonable accommodations. And this could range largely from, like, when we talk about physical and infrastructural barriers. There was a student who told me that a wheelchair user student with spina bifida told me that, hey, there is a water cooler right outside my room, but it is located 2 3 stairs above. So there is an entire floor, but the water cooler is accessible only with someone who can climb stairs. Like, even if it is 2 stairs, it is significant. It is a significant difficulty for somebody who is on a wheelchair. Now, she had to be dependent on somebody who can give her a bottle of water. Now, imagine if you have to depend on somebody at all points in time for something as basic as getting access to water, drinking water. It's not that there is no drinking water. The fact that you have to ask so many people and you have to face so many barriers to even reach that water cooler is extremely problematic, and it is not done. Like, it's not justified to even create an infrastructure which is so inaccessible, especially when you know that the ground floor is probably meant for, or is going to be occupied by, persons with disabilities or wheelchair users, for specifically, who can't even climb 2 stairs. So this is like a very, like, just one example, and it's just the tip of the iceberg. There are these ramps that are created in law school, in any public place, including law schools, that some students told me that these ramps were so dysfunctional that the very texture, or the very the path of on the ramp was not maintained well enough, and if they use their wheelchair, and if they use their ramp to go down, like with the wheelchair, they would have probably fallen off the wheelchair, because that's how ill maintained the ramp is, and that's how non functional it is, for that matter. Now all of these are very, like, basic things that you need to take into consideration when you are even setting up your infrastructure, and when you're even and not just setting it up, even if it's a new law school, if you have made sure that your infrastructure is accessible, there needs to be constant audits of your infrastructure to make sure that all that you have taken into consideration when building the building, or building the campus in the first place, all these specific needs are maintained, and everything is done in order that, like, these special infrastructure in terms of ramps or tactile tiles or audio video or audio signals, etc., are maintained, and there are regular checks that are, in play with respect to making sure that these are in fact functional, and they're not just tokenistic symbols. And this is another very predominant observation that I noticed, that even the smallest of initiatives that are taken by educational institutions, it is taken in the sense of being a very, a charitable approach. A charity approach is taken into consideration when something is done in terms of disability rights. Just because there is a ramp, or just because they have created like ramps or tactile tiles or audio signals, they feel like it's a very benevolent move from their side to even think or do of something like this, notwithstanding the fact that there is a mandatory requirement, a reservation of 3 to 4% that is mandated by the law in educational institutions, in higher education. And if reservation is a mandate by the law, by extension it is also your duty as the administration, or as people forming a law school, to make sure that these people who are coming by way of reservation, or even by merit, who are persons with disabilities, are able to go through the rest of their law school, or are able to access education in the same manner without having to face extra barriers just because they are persons with disabilities. Now, these are only physical and infrastructural barriers that I've spoken about. Then, coming to academic barriers, even in a classroom, when a majority of my participants were persons with visual impairment or complete blindness, they mentioned that, hey, when graphs are being explained to us, or when there are graphs being explained in the classroom at large, uh, there is very little vocalization of explanation of what the graphs in fact contain. Or if there are pie charts, what does the pie chart exactly contain? Very little of that is explained verbally. Just giving, they are, it's taken into consideration, it's taken for granted that everybody in the class is able to see the board, or is able to see the projector, even though persons with visual impairment or blindness are very visibly in the class, and the person who's taking the lecture is very cognizant of the fact that there is a person with blindness or visual impairment, and therefore it is their duty to vocalize and articulate everything that is on a surface. But teachers are not sensitized enough to be able to even execute something like that, and that is extremely sad, and that's not even justified. It's not a reason enough, or it's not a justification enough to give them the benefit of doubt. We are living, it's 2023 now. That's like 2016 the act was passed, 2017 the RPWD rules were passed. It's been so many years ever since. It's been 7 years since the time these acts have come into place. And the fact that there are no checks and balances in place to make sure that the law is in fact implemented, and there are policies in place specifically for persons with disabilities, is extremely, very demeaning for persons with disabilities and for their existence. And as is the basic principle of the UNCRPD, just by virtue of being a human being, you are deserving of respect. You need not be a meritorious student in order to get respect. You need not be some iconic person in order to get respect. You need not be, somebody who's only recognized by news media or who has made headlines in order to get respect or the reasonable accommodations that you require to live your normal life. And without recognizing this fact, and without reinforcing this every now and then, authorities are not going to take cognizance of this. And that's extremely sad. And that spills into my third category of administrative rigidity. There was one very specific instance of a student who is hard of hearing who let me know that, their doctor told them that, because they're hard of hearing, they should be given receivers, and the teachers who are conducting the class should hold these receivers so that the voice of the person is augmented enough so that the person who is hard of hearing is able to follow the class. And this is a very basic accommodation that is required of a person who cannot hear as clearly as an able bodied person. Now, you won't believe, the teacher first mentioned that they have no problem, like the teachers have no problem in holding a receiver. At the end of the day, you just probably have to tuck it on your collar or you have to hold it in your hand, which is not too much of an ask. But the administration later on went to say that they don't have the funds to buy receivers, and they cannot like carve out funds specifically to get receivers for one person. Now imagine, first of all, hard of hearing or deaf students are very, very rare in law schools. There were only two persons who were deaf who have, like, in the past so many years and decades. That is very representative of the fact that because law schools are inaccessible by nature, and because the law is inaccessible in its very form, persons who are hard of hearing or persons who are deaf are not even encouraged to take this as, or even consider the law as a profession that they would want to pursue. And in the rare case that these two three people who have studied the law or who are pursuing law across law schools, they are not given the accommodations. There are no sign language interpreters. They don't even know about sign language interpreters. They don't even know they can ask for this. And I think that in order to meet all these challenges, it is a prerequisite for all law schools and for all educational institutions to take an audit before an academic year even starts, to make sure what are the different kinds of persons with disabilities who are taking admission, and what are their specific needs that are required in order for them to be able to complete their course without having to think too much about accommodations that they require. This is a very basic thing that needs to that has very sadly not even gone into the heads of the administration
Yeah.
across colleges, across education institutions. I am speaking only from the law school perspective because I have access only to law schools. But I am so sure that there is not even one college or one higher education school or one even primary school, except if they are special needs school in itself.
Yeah.
There is nobody who is taking into consideration all of these factors. And lastly, the social and attitudinal barriers, like I've already spoken about,
Mm.
these are barriers that, there are so many students who have told me that their peer groups itself exclude them from parties, from batch parties, exclude them from competitions like moot court competitions and client counseling competitions or negotiation competitions, mediation competitions. These are competitions that every law student has the right to participate in order to augment their advocacy skills. Now, just because a person is visually impaired or blind or can't hear does not mean that they are not able or they are not, meritorious enough to be able to take part in this competition and excel. But they stop at the very fact that they are not able to even participate in this because all of these competitions happen in a group, in a team. And the very fact that these team members who are able-bodied persons don't even consider them as meritorious enough to be a part of them, they get stopped right at the first stage. So these are the small social and attitudinal barriers which, if there is no sensitization that is held across these stakeholders in education institutions, it's extremely difficult to combat and go beyond. what is required for persons with disabilities in order for them to even live their academic life fully.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Thank
that
you.
was quite
Yes.
a mouthful.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you. In the interest of time, I will
Yes.
probably
Yeah, would you
move.
like to, yeah, go ahead and share the next part of what you would like to address, the steps, or probably the barriers faced by journalists with disabilities in their
Yeah,
profession?
yeah, yeah. They are similar actually. So, I spoke to a bunch of journalists with disabilities working in newsrooms and found that the barriers begin even prior to joining the industry. So, parents of journalists, especially women with disabilities, are always wary of their kids joining journalism because it is considered to be a risky and a fast paced industry. So, one journalist who's a wheelchair user told me that, her parents said the same thing. And while she was able to convince them, when she joined the journalism school, she found that uh, her hospital was inaccessible and she it didn't have a lift, so she faced a lot of accessibility issues there. There are barriers to employment as well. People are
Mm,
wary to disclose their disability. They fear mentioning it in their CV because they are worried they won't be invited for an interview.
right,
One person I spoke to who uses a wheelchair said that they weren't invited for an interview because the newsroom wasn't accessible. So she kept waiting for months, and they said, the moment we get a ramp, we'll invite you.
right,
She kept, but then it never really happened.
right.
Um, Another journalist with cerebral palsy who uses a wheelchair told me that their newsroom hired them but made them wait for one whole year till they got an accessible toilet constructed. I mean, imagine, you're employed somewhere, you cannot, you already have your offer letter, and after that, you have to wait for 1 year to join, and you really can't join another office because you want to join that one. So that is how it went for them. No proper income for that whole year.
Mm,
Then there are, of course, barriers inside the newsroom. One blind journalist mentioned that when they were first hired and they reached their newsroom, their colleagues were really surprised to see them and asked, "How will you be able to help us?" I mean, they had
mm,
never seen anyone who was blind in the business and didn't know how a blind person would work. So they would ask, funny questions. How will you report? How will you go to the site? How will you
mm,
commute? So the journalist said, just the same as you would. I'll take an auto. I'm pretty independent.
mm,
So it's difficult for co-workers to even understand because they never worked with someone who's with blindness. So this is how bad the
right,
underrepresentation of journalists with disability is, and this is the implication.
right.
Then one wheelchair user told me how difficult it was for her to work late
Mm,
night shift when housekeeping help had already left. She needed help to be taken to the washroom because the washroom was inaccessible and she couldn't use it independently. So she was
mm,
completely reliant on housekeeping help. And when they left, she couldn't. She just couldn't go to the washroom, and what happens.
mm,
Another thing, as a wheelchair user, she had to book accessible cabs to commute to the office, which was an extra expense, which wasn't factored into her pay. Now, this is a reasonable
right.
accommodation for a person with disability. Either the office provides accessible transport or pays for it.
Mm,
Then, of course, there were barriers to belonging as well, as I found. One journalist who has ADHD and autism said that her colleagues just don't make the time for understanding and accommodating her neurodiversity. She keeps
mm,
asking for reasonable accommodations, small things, which would only require tweaking one's working style a bit. Like she would
mm,
ask her editor, could you please give me a sense of the timeline of publication? Tell me which story you want to work on first. Because she gets anxious when she doesn't know all this in advance.
Mm,
But, you know, her editor, sometimes she would do it and sometimes just forget about it.
mm,
There wasn't enough, attention given to these details.
right,
Neurotypical people often compare neurodiverse people's problems to their own situation. For
right.
example, if a person with mental distress says, I'm depressed, a lot of
Mm,
people have a tendency to answer back, okay, oh, I have also been having a bad week with so many
yeah,
things going wrong. Buck up, you will be fine. Things will
right,
pass soon. Which is not what a person with clinical depression should be experiencing. If a neurodiverse person says, I'm unable to process information or unable to focus or take a decision, it's a clinical problem. And neurotypical people should not make light of it.
correct,
And that is
correct,
what, when they do that, it's actually ableism.
correct, absolutely.
Yeah.
And these are very condescending remarks, like the ones which you pointed out. And
Yeah,
these are very commonplace. I'm not even
they are.
surprised because they are so predominant.
Right. Now, I think in the interest of time, I will ask you to, very quickly,
Yeah,
probably a minute, talk about the challenges you faced
right,
taking, the exercise of speaking to law students,
correct.
how you
So,
address them. Yeah.
right. So very crisply, the challenges that I faced when I even undertook this survey and started speaking to law students. There was a lot of hesitation among law students to even share their story, even though I had very explicitly told them that, hey, you know what, this is confidential. Your identity is not going to be disclosed in the piece that I write, and in no firm will your law school or the administration in your law school get to know that you have participated in the survey, because everything from top to bottom, your responses, your identity, everything is going to be confidential. Even despite reiterating this a gazillion times, it took me a lot of effort to convince them to share their story with me, which is very sad. Because any if I was asked these questions, if a journalist had asked me to share my lived experiences in order for there to be reform during my time, I would have jumped at any occasion to share my lived experiences. But the reality today of law students is induced, like their behavior is influenced a lot by fear psychosis. And this is extremely sad, because being law students, the last thing you want to do is act out of fear, because tomorrow you're going to be lawyers and you cannot be acting out of fear in your profession. And you need to start implementing and practicing and building those etiquettes or values within yourselves as law students itself. And it took me a lot of convincing, it took me a lot to even get these stories out of these students. And even then, there were very few students who agreed to speak to me on call. There were few students who were very happy to share with me over an hour long of chat on call, that all their lived experiences. But there were few who probably cut the conversation in 15 minutes, 20 minutes, 30 minutes. And there were some who I had to reach out to only through an anonymized Google form, like a Google document, which had questions, like a questionnaire of a Google form. And even then, their identity was kept anonymous. I only asked for their law school name and which year they are studying in, and their disability, and the specific questions that I had to ask. But even then, it took me so much of following up to even get them to write their responses in a Google form. And it was not an exhaustive form. It barely had 5 or 6 detailed, like, questions which they had to answer in detail, but they still never answered more than a line or two. And these are very fundamental barriers that I faced. And if I asked them to put their contact number in the form, they would not do that, because they didn't want to be contacted, they didn't want to share their identity, even if that meant that I told them a gazillion times that it's going to be confidential. Now, how did I approach this? I obviously had someone to assist me. There was an intern to assist me to keep following up with these students who we recognized were persons with disabilities. And it was only after these constant touching base with them that they agreed to even give their responses. But there were still about 3 4 students who did not budge even after multiple follow-ups. Now, I tried to look at it from their perspective, and I tried to give the people who did not budge their space, and I did not prod any further. But the ones who really wanted to share their experiences, or the ones who shared their experiences in brief, I made sure to have a conversation with them even after their Google Doc form, or when they were talking on call, to keep following up with the nuances of the experiences that they shared. Because there were some people who literally told me that I am so thankful to you for, I have never felt heard or seen before this conversation that I'm having with you. And that was all. Like, I felt my life purpose as a journalist was fulfilled when I got this one statement from them, that they felt heard or seen. Because I myself, as a person with disability, as a law student with disability, would have wanted something similar, but nothing of the sort ever happened until I took the initiative. So that's about it. I mean, this is how. And some of my strengths I recognized when I was interviewing these students is that, because I have lived experiences, I had the patience to listen to these students share their experiences and share their realities, and I could empathize with them. And the empathy was the basis of this entire activity and this entire series of articles and the survey that I undertook. Because until you bring these stories to limelight, this is going to be shrouded in oblivion. Nobody is going to even give two damns about these people, and they are going to be, they're going to remain quiet. There was a minority number of, like, there was a minority participants among the survey who said that we didn't even, like, we never even thought of asking for these accommodations which would be necessary for us, because we knew that, these are things that we probably will not get. And they had internalized that they are not going to get it. So, like, when people internalize that they are not worthy of getting something which they deserve, then that's the battle lost at the first instance itself.
Mm.
So yeah, that's and the mentality was basically, if I do not do it, who is going to do it? I am a journalist who has, like, multiple disabilities, and if I am able to empathize, or if I can think from their perspective, then they need to be able to have the channel through me to be able to put their stories to limelight. And that was just about it. Do you want to conclude, Preeti, by sharing your last, what are your recommendations or steps to make an organization, news organization, inclusive of persons with disabilities?
Yeah. And just it's not just about news organizations, but also any organization. I think
Correct.
the steps that I'm going to talk about can be taken by any organization for disability.
Right.
So one might think it is difficult and daunting to be accessible and be inclusive of disability because of the sheer diversity of disabilities. But believe
Absolutely.
me, you don't have to know everything when you start. It's a process, and you'll keep learning as you make your way through things.
Correct.
The most important thing is to be uncomfortable about not being inclusive. So I would say start by learning the legal requirements of hiring a person with disability. Read the disability law in your country and understand your obligations to provide reasonable accommodations, and ensure there is no discrimination. Work on accessibility for everyone and not just for people you already hired. This is very important because a large number of people with invisible disabilities, like psychosocial disabilities or even partial hearing loss or partial vision loss, do not disclose it. A lot of people don't even know they have a disability, and they will all
Correct.
definitely benefit from inclusive approaches. So let's take the example of captions. Hard of hearing people, people with ADHD, people who are learning the language, all will benefit from captions, not just deaf people. Believe me, anyone who's distracted or feeling a bit tired can also benefit from having information, presented in through captions, or in more than one way. Hire someone to assess the physical accessibility of your workspace, including entrances, exits, restrooms, workstations. Ensure that the office is wheelchair accessible and that there are accommodations for individuals with visual or hearing impairments. Computers might need extra software for a blind person. For inclusive hiring, consider using a variety of recruitment channels to reach candidates with disabilities, collaborate with disability organizations, job boards, and platforms which are focused on inclusive hiring. It's not difficult to find people. I mean, I heard this many times. Where do I get disabled people? Where do I get a journalist who's disabled? Oh, it's not difficult. You just have to approach these organizations. Ensure that your application process is accessible to candidates with disabilities. And this includes providing alternative formats for application materials and offering accessible interview spaces. Be prepared to provide reasonable accommodations to employees with disabilities, such as assistive technology, flexible work hours. I mean, which is so easy to do now after the pandemic because it's a thing. It's been accepted. Accessible transportation, and probably modified tasks. Foster an inclusive culture that values diversity and treats all employees with respect. I think that's the bottom line. Ensure that existing staff members are aware of the importance of inclusivity and are prepared to support their new colleagues. Awareness is crucial, and you will need to provide training to staff on disability etiquette, inclusivity, and appropriate language. Trainers are available who will happily do this for you, and I'm one of them. I'm also a trainer, so in case you need me, just reach out. Avoid making assumptions about a candidate's capabilities or limitations based on their disability. Focus on their skills, qualifications, and experience instead. Understand that candidates with disabilities are not obligated to disclose their disability during the recruitment process. If they choose to disclose, respect their privacy and ensure that the information is kept confidential if they so like. Then consider providing mentorship and support programs for new employees with disabilities. Also provide office buddies during the onboarding process. And this actually goes for any new hire. It can help anybody who's just new to the organization. And this helps them acclimatize to the workplace and feel valued. Regularly assess and evaluate your workplace's inclusivity and accessibility. Seek feedback from employees with disabilities and make necessary adjustments from time to time. Recruiting staff with disabilities is an opportunity to enhance the organization's diversity, creativity, and innovation. People with disabilities are innovators, so hire them. Prioritizing inclusivity from the recruitment stage onward will create a positive and welcoming work environment for all employees. Be accommodating of people's needs. Just keep asking, how can we help? Say that we haven't recruited anyone with similar needs before, so please let us know what you need. I mean, these are questions that will take you a long way. And for newsrooms specifically, I would add that before approaching a person with disabilities for an interview, journalists need the same kind of preparation and background research as they do for anyone else, any other source. Find out about the disability, read about it, ask about their access needs during the interview. Language and photography style guides are available to adapt coverage. Guidance on how to talk to a person with disability, how to interview them is available. My paper is also a good guide, so I suggest you check it out. And reporting should be based on the rights-based social model, meaning it should rest upon the legal rights of people with disabilities and not on the charity and medical models, that have long expired. So to give you some context, the medical model views disability as a problem located within the individual, often focusing on the individual's impairments or medical conditions that need to be fixed. In contrast, the social model of disability shifts the focus away from individual impairments and places it on societal and environmental factors that contribute to disabling experiences. And that is the correct way to approach disability reporting. Yeah, and of course, you need to make your website and social media accessible. Use alt text. captions on videos, text to speech, transcript for podcasts, no strobing or flashing on websites, no autoplayed videos, advertisements, etc. I think I'll wind up here in the interest of time. Anand is already there. Thank you so much.
I think the crux of this is just that there needs to be acceptance of persons with disabilities. And so long as there is acceptance, automatically sensitization will happen and automatically these things will fall into place. But this is a very idealistic, statement that I'm making. It does not happen automatically until there are very deliberate interventions that are made. So, yeah, that's about it, I think.
Thank you, Preeti and Jelsyna, for having this fireside conversation on this topic. The audience were pretty much engaged, and they are appreciating your comments, your insight, your personal experiences, your observations, and your recommendations also. And there are a few questions that I would like to say, but we have a short with time, so I would like to request Ki, if you can give
Sure.
insight on that. Yeah. So there is a question which has been asked by Anug. I'm just projecting this. She's asking that regarding people from deaf community in 2019, INB Ministry, which is Information and Broadcasting Ministry, released a notification instructing the channels to put captions to their programs. Is 2023, and news channels etc. running their programs without captioning on cable TV unless OTT shows them. So I'm wondering what steps should the government take for every channel to follow this stringently. Over to you both.
So I think that like these are circulars, these are mandates that are required by the law and policy. But the reason why they don't really materialize like in effect or on ground is because there is no checks and balance system. There is nobody to make sure that the laws or the policies that are laid down by the government or by the legislature, there is nobody to see whether that is in fact coming into play. And so long as there is no checks and balance in place, there is no use of the law being in paper. There is no use of any circulars, there are no use of any notifications or any government intervention until that intervention actually is to keep in place an authority to make sure that all of this is in fact followed. So I think broadly that's my response. And it is the need of the hour to probably create posts within the government itself, so that all of this, that is all the mandates of the law are in fact abided by.
Hmm.
That is, I think, a key recommendation which needs to be taken cognizance of.
I would just quickly add that, if you have people with disabilities within government organizations like the Bharati and the Ministry of Information and Broadcasting, it would definitely help because, then these laws which already exist can be pushed a little bit. Because in case of other things as well, while the RPWB Act was, enforced in, April 2017, there are so many things that haven't been implemented, but I'm seeing in other aspects, it's the activists who are taking this forward, and when they push for it, it happens. So even like I've seen in Delhi, things are happening because there's like the activism is very strong.
Right.
Thank you. You both beautifully answered the question. Like there should be some check mechanism, a structure should be created. So
Correct.
there are few more attendees who are like appreciating your work, and they're also saying the similar question. Like they want to know, like you have already shared this thing. Like there should be acceptance. We should be like uh, putting them ourselves in their shoes, and we should talk about this. But they want to. But people are asking that what we can do as an individual to build an ecosystem where everyone is feeling accessible, and if there are some resources, so what should I look for? What are the resources which which can help us to like make things accessible as an individual?
I think that's a brilliant question, and it's coming from a place of a genuine intent to make ecosystems and work like places more accessible and inclusive. And thank you for whoever asked that question. I think the starting point, like I mentioned, is just have a mentality of acceptance, and probably if you have accepted persons with disabilities as one among everybody else, try to make an attempt to share that with someone else and sensitize probably one or two more people among like your friends or peer groups, and the ripple effect that will be created will be enormous, even though we may think of it as a very small move, but it is a very significant move if each one can teach another. So I think that's my response. So as long as there is acceptance and there is a mindful approach taken to not uh, state condescending statements or not say condescending things or not be overly helpful of persons with disabilities while they are doing their everyday chores, I think everyday chores are going about their everyday life. I think we are good enough to have created that inclusive space. Don't be disrespectful, just be mindful of what you say and the way you behave. I think that's a good starting point.
Yeah, thank you for that. That's wonderful. I would just like to add that, if you work, let's say, working wherever you're working in your workplace, when there are events conducted or just a lunch or a dinner or something, just make sure that you choose a place which is accessible so that in case you have, I'm sure if it's a very big gathering, you wouldn't know who needs accessibility. So it would be ideal if you choose a place which is accessible. If you have friends, probably you haven't met because they don't come out because of their disability, then find out from them, find out what their access needs could be, just start talking to them, and and then create an environment where you can maybe find a place to meet, an accessible place to meet. Because the problem is that a lot of people with disabilities are unable to socialize. They are not, because they don't come out, they are not seen in public places. People don't know that they exist. So unless that accessibility is created, it won't happen. And I know that as individuals, unless you are in a place of influence, you cannot do that. But as individuals, you can just start asking people, and that would help. And then maybe tell your managers that let's go to a place which is accessible. Let's find a place which is accessible.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I think just creating that environment of respect and acceptance of persons with disabilities is like great. I
Yeah.
mean, yeah.
And I would also say that all of us use social media, so that is why it is very, very easy to make social media accessible, and that also widens your reach. It doesn't
Mhm.
exclude a person with disability. So if you just Google it, it's also there in my paper if you want. It's in my profile. But if you just Google it, you'll find ways of making, Twitter, Instagram, everything accessible. And these are very, very, very minor changes that you have to make while posting. It's not difficult at all. And yeah, believe me, you'll just feel very good when you've done it. You just feel that you made the reach, you widen the reach of what you want to say.
Hmm.
Right.
Thank you, Priti Jelsyna, for sharing some action step for an individual to make ecosystem accessible for everybody. Another participant sharing her experience and asking for a question also.
Sure.
So she's sharing that during her master's in social work, disability studies and action, she did the dissertation on inclusive education in Delhi's government school. And she found that among the government school teachers, 49 respondents, which is 66%, are aware of the existing policies related to inclusive education. Facilities including devices, infrastructure and support are available to teachers for facilitating children for disability education. But there is a still room for improvement. So she wants to know that what can be done to bring more resources for people with visible and invisible disabilities. I think she's more talking about schools and in regard with teachers and trainers.
Right.
Yeah.
Understood. So, I would say that I would go back to what I had initially mentioned as part of my talk, that it's very difficult for me as a person with, a set number of disabilities to speak for somebody else with a diverse kind of disabilities, or to speak for a group of people across the disability spectrum. So, I would only say that instead of thinking of what more can be done, I think there needs to be a policy change that needs to come into play with respect to having a disability officer across education institutions, and that disability officer or this personnel needs to make sure, needs to conduct an audit to see what are the different kinds of persons with disabilities who are taking admission or who are part of the institution already, and individually ask them specifically what are the needs or accommodations that they require. And because it's very specific to each individual, and it's very difficult to answer a question like this very generically, because it's dangerous to answer a question like this very generically, because it will come with an assumption that I know everything about all disabilities, which is absolutely not right. Nobody knows everything about all disabilities. Only a person who has lived experiences can speak for themselves with their respect to their specific disability. So I think there should be one person, one point of contact, who make sure that the needs of persons across disabilities are met.
Yeah.
Thank you. So with this, I would like to conclude today's session. So as we conclude this fireside chat on accessibility in newsrooms and education at the Changemakers 20 Summit, I would like to express my gratitude to our distinguished panelists, Ms. Priti and Jelsyna, and our engaged audience as well for their valuable insight and thoughtful discussion. Throughout this conversation, we have delved into the crucial intersection of accessibility, media, and education. The topics we have explored are not only relevant to our current times, but also essential for shaping a more inclusive and equitable future. Our speakers have shed light on the challenges faced by individuals with disabilities in assessing news and educational content. We have highlighted the importance of adopting universal design principles to ensure that information reached every corner of society, regardless of physical or cognitive limitation. Moreover, the role of technology in revolutionizing accessibility has been a recurring theme, empathizing the potential of artificial intelligence, machine learning to make accessibility to the people. We have learned that creating accessible newsrooms and educational environment requires a multifaceted approach. Collaboration between content creators, educators, technologists, and policymakers is a vital to drive positive change. By sharing best practices, developing new tools, and advocating for policy reforms, we can move towards a more inclusive society for which where everyone has equal access of information to and education. Thank you for your active participation and unwavering commitment to the accessibility. Let's carry these insights forward and work together to make lasting impact.